The school principal's voice cracked as he stood outside in the cold December air, repeating the same 5 words over and over, like a man trapped in a nightmare he couldn't wake from. "I know she's dead. I know she's dead." His hands trembled. His face had gone pale. When the first officer arrived and asked him what he'd seen inside, the principal could barely form the words. "It was horrible," he whispered. "Her face was covered in blood, bruised, beaten. The entire place looked like a war zone." Inside that modest home lay the body of Christy Maroc, a beloved 6th-grade teacher who would never see another Christmas, never grade another paper, never hear the laughter of her students again. What should have been a season of joy and celebration had become the beginning of one of Pennsylvania's most frustrating and haunting cold cases. A mystery that would consume investigators for nearly 3 decades and leave an entire community wondering how a killer could hide in plain sight. Before we go any further with this chilling story, I need you to do something important right now to encourage us. Hit that subscribe button, smash the like, drop a comment telling us where you are watching from. Your support is what keeps these forgotten stories alive and helps us reach more people who are searching for answers. Every subscription, every like, every comment matters because it means another voice is demanding justice for victims like Christy Maroc. Now, let's dive deep into this case and uncover how one piece of chewing gum would finally crack a mystery that stumped some of the best investigators in Pennsylvania. December 21st, 1992. Just 4 days before Christmas. The halls of the elementary school where Christy Maroc taught should have been filled with the sounds of children singing carols and the rustle of wrapping paper. Instead, there was confusion. Christy hadn't shown up for class. This wasn't like her at all. Christy Maroc was the kind of teacher every parent hoped their child would have. Dedicated, patient, always early, always prepared. When the morning bell rang and her classroom remained empty, the school administration knew something was seriously wrong. The principal decided to drive to Christy's home himself. It was a cold morning, the kind where your breath hangs in the air like tiny clouds. As he pulled up to her house, nothing seemed immediately out of place. The neighborhood was quiet, normal. He walked to the front door and knocked. No answer. He knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. That's when he noticed the door wasn't quite closed. It was slightly ajar, just enough to send a chill down his spine that had nothing to do with the December weather. He pushed the door open slowly, calling out Christy's name. The moment he stepped inside, he knew. The house was in disarray, furniture overturned, things scattered across the floor. And then he saw her. Christy Maroc lay motionless, her face battered and bloodied beyond recognition. The principal didn't need to check for a pulse. The scene told him everything he needed to know. He backed out of the house immediately, his mind reeling. And that's when the only words he could manage began spilling from his mouth. "I know she's dead. I know she's dead." The Lancaster County Police Department responded within minutes. When the first officers entered Christy's home, they found themselves standing in the middle of what was clearly a violent struggle. This hadn't been a quick, clean murder. This had been brutal, personal. The kind of violence that speaks to rage, to passion, to something deeply wrong between the killer and the victim. Christy had fought back. That much was obvious from the state of the room and the defensive wounds on her body. But she'd been overpowered, overwhelmed, and ultimately, she'd lost her life in her own home just days before the holiday she'd been preparing to celebrate. The medical examiner's report would later confirm what the scene suggested. Christy had been beaten severely. The injuries to her face and head were extensive. She'd been struck multiple times with enough force to cause fatal trauma. The brutality of the attack suggested the killer knew her. Random home invasions rarely involve this level of violence. Stranger murders are typically quick, functional, focused on robbery or sexual assault. But this was different. This felt personal. This felt like someone who had a reason, however twisted and unjustifiable, to want Christy Marak dead. The investigation began immediately, and it was massive in scope. The Lancaster County Police Department brought in every available detective. The Pennsylvania State Police offered assistance. The FBI was consulted. This was a beloved teacher murdered just before Christmas in a quiet neighborhood. The community was terrified. Parents were afraid. Teachers were looking over their shoulders. Everyone wanted answers, and they wanted them fast. Detectives started with the basics. Who had access to Christy's home? Who knew her schedule? Who had seen her last? They began interviewing everyone in Christy's life. Her colleagues at school, her friends, her neighbors, her family members, anyone who might have information about her final hours. The interviews started numbering in the dozens, then the hundreds. Every lead was followed. Every potential witness was questioned. Every piece of evidence was cataloged and analyzed. As the days turned into weeks, the investigation expanded. Detectives identified potential suspects, men who had been seen in the area, people who had criminal records, anyone who might have had contact with Christy in the days leading up to her murder. The suspect list grew. 10 names became 20. 20 became 40. By the time the first year of investigation had passed, more than 60 individuals had been identified as persons of interest. Each one was investigated thoroughly, backgrounds checked, alibis verified, timelines constructed, and one by one they were eliminated. Either their alibis held up, or the evidence didn't connect them to the crime scene, or their DNA didn't match biological evidence recovered from Christy's home. The DNA evidence was crucial, but in 1992, the technology wasn't what it is today. Detectives had collected biological samples from the crime scene, but the ability to analyze and compare DNA was still in its relative infancy. The samples were preserved, carefully stored, waiting for the day when science might catch up to the needs of justice. But in the meantime, investigators had to rely on old-fashioned detective work, interviews, timelines, physical evidence, witness statements, the tedious, painstaking process of building a case piece by piece. As 1992 became 1993, the leads began to slow down. The initial flood of tips and potential witnesses dried up. The media attention faded. Other crimes demanded the attention of local law enforcement. And while Christy Marak's case remained open, it began to cool. Not because investigators didn't care, but because they'd exhausted every lead they had. They'd interviewed over 1,500 people. They'd followed up on countless tips. They'd checked and rechecked alibis. They'd analyzed and reanalyzed evidence. And still, they had no solid suspect, no clear motive, no witness who could place a specific person at Christy's home at the time of her murder. The case went cold, not officially closed, but dormant, waiting. The detectives who worked it never forgot. They kept the files. They reviewed the evidence periodically, hoping that fresh eyes or new technology might reveal something they had missed. But as the years passed, the likelihood of solving Christy Marak's murder seemed to diminish. 1993 became 2000. 2000 became 2010, and still, no breakthrough, no arrest, no justice for Christy or her family. Christy's mother took the unsolved murder especially hard. Losing a child is every parent's worst nightmare. Losing a child to violence, to murder, and then watching the case go unsolved year after year after year is a special kind of torture. But Christy's mother was facing another battle simultaneously. She'd been diagnosed with cancer. The disease was aggressive, and her prognosis wasn't good. But she refused to give up. She refused to die without knowing who had killed her daughter. She clung to life with a determination that amazed her doctors and devastated her family. Every chemotherapy session, every radiation treatment, every painful day was endured with one singular hope burning in her heart: justice for Christy. She wanted to see the killer's face. She wanted to hear his name. She wanted to know why. And she wanted to see him held accountable before she took her last breath. Meanwhile, life in Lancaster continued. The community gradually moved on, as communities do. The fear that had gripped the town in the immediate aftermath of Christy's murder slowly faded. People stopped locking their doors quite so carefully. Parents stopped watching their children quite so closely. The memory of Christy Marak became a sad story that older residents told newcomers, a tragedy, a shame, an unsolved mystery that would probably never be solved. But there was one person in Lancaster who hadn't moved on, one person who thought about Christy Marak regularly, one person who knew exactly what had happened in that house on December 21st, 1992. One person who carried the secret of her murder every single day. And that person was living openly in the community, not hiding, not running, not looking over his shoulder in fear of discovery. He was a local celebrity, a familiar face, a man people trusted and liked, a man who spent his weekends bringing joy to others while carrying the darkest of secrets. He was a disc jockey, a DJ, popular in the Lancaster area. A man of Puerto Rican descent who had built a reputation as the go-to entertainer for weddings, parties, and nightclub events. He had a following. People requested him specifically. Brides wanted him at their receptions. Club owners counted on him to pack their dance floors. He was charming, outgoing, fun. The kind of person who lights up a room when he walks in. And nobody, not one single person in all those years, suspected that this smiling, dancing, laughing man had beaten Christy Marak to death in her own home. The irony is almost unbearable. While Christy's mother was fighting cancer and clinging to life in the desperate hope of seeing justice, the man who'd stolen her daughter's life was out there spinning records at wedding receptions. While detectives were reviewing cold case files and hoping for a breakthrough, he was taking requests and making people dance. While the community mourned the unsolved murder of a beloved teacher, her killer was collecting tips and booking his next gig. He was hiding in plain sight, protected not by some elaborate disguise or false identity, but by the simple fact that nobody suspected him. Why would they? He seemed like such a nice guy. This is one of the most frustrating aspects of many cold cases, the assumption that killers look a certain way, act a certain way, that they're obviously dangerous or suspicious or somehow marked by their crimes. But the reality is often exactly the opposite. Many killers are charming, likable, successful. They have friends and families. They go to work. They contribute to their communities. They smile for photographs. And all the while, they carry their secrets, confident that they've gotten away with murder. If you're still watching at this point, drop a comment with, "I'm still here." Let's see who's truly following this shocking story and who's committed to seeing justice finally delivered for Christy Maroc. Your engagement helps us know these stories matter to you. As the 2000s progressed, forensic science was advancing rapidly. DNA technology that had been cutting edge in the 90s was becoming standard procedure. The ability to extract and analyze DNA from smaller and smaller samples improved dramatically. Databases expanded, techniques were refined. What had once taken weeks could now be done in days. What had once required large samples could now be done with just a few cells. The revolution in forensic DNA analysis was changing criminal investigations across the country, and cold cases were being reopened and solved at an unprecedented rate. The detectives in Lancaster were well aware of these advances. They'd been waiting for this. The biological evidence collected from Christy Maroc's crime scene had been carefully preserved for exactly this reason. They'd known that someday, the technology would exist to extract more information from those samples. And now that day had come. In the mid-2000s, the decision was made to reopen Christie's case and submit the biological evidence for advanced DNA analysis. The results were promising. The new techniques allowed forensic scientists to develop a much more detailed DNA profile from the evidence. They now had a genetic fingerprint of the killer. The problem was that this profile didn't match anyone in the criminal databases. The killer, whoever he was, had never been arrested for a serious crime. He'd never had his DNA collected and entered into the system. So, while investigators now knew his genetic code, they still didn't know his name. This is where the case sat for several more years. Investigators had a DNA profile, but no match. They continued to follow up on tips. They continued to interview potential witnesses. But without a match in the database, they were essentially waiting for luck or for the killer to make a mistake. And for years, neither happened. The DJ continued his career. Christie's mother continued her battle with cancer. And the case remained unsolved. Then came the breakthrough that nobody could have predicted. It wasn't a dramatic confession. It wasn't a witness suddenly coming forward with new information. It wasn't even a match in a criminal database. It was a piece of chewing gum. One single piece of discarded chewing gum that would finally, after more than 2 decades, connect the DNA from Christie's crime scene to a specific individual. Genetic genealogy was the key. This relatively new investigative technique uses DNA analysis combined with genealogical research to identify suspects through their family trees. Even if a suspect's DNA isn't in a criminal database, his relative's DNA might be in public genealogy databases. By analyzing shared genetic markers, investigators can build a family tree and narrow down potential suspects. It's the same technology that helps adoptees find their birth parents and people discover unknown relatives. But in the hands of law enforcement, it becomes a powerful tool for solving cold cases. Investigators submitted the DNA profile from Christie's crime scene to a genetic genealogy company. The analysis came back with several potential family lines. Genealogists worked backwards, building out family trees, identifying individuals who fit the geographic and age parameters of the suspect. The pool of potential suspects narrowed, and narrowed, and narrowed, until finally investigators had a short list of names. Men who were in the Lancaster area in 1992. Men who were the right age. Men who had the right genetic background based on the family tree analysis. One name kept coming up. The DJ. The local celebrity. The man who'd been living openly in the community for more than 25 years. At first, investigators were skeptical. This guy? The popular wedding DJ? The man with no criminal record, no history of violence, no obvious connection to Christy Marak? But genetic genealogy doesn't lie. The family tree pointed directly to him. If the DNA from the crime scene belonged to anyone, it belonged to him or a very close male relative. Now came the challenge of confirming it. Investigators couldn't just arrest him based on genetic genealogy alone. They needed a direct DNA sample from the suspect himself to compare to the crime scene evidence. So they began surveillance. They watched him, followed him, waited for an opportunity to collect a DNA sample without tipping him off that he was under investigation. They needed something he'd touched, something he'd discarded, something that contained his saliva or skin cells, something they could legally collect without a warrant. And then it happened. The DJ was performing at an event. Afterwards, investigators watching from a distance saw him throw something away. A piece of chewing gum, wrapped in a tissue and tossed into a public trash can. It was perfect. Public trash is legally fair game for law enforcement. No warrant needed, no privacy expectation. Investigators retrieved the tissue, carefully preserved the chewing gum, and sent it to the lab for DNA analysis. The wait for the results must have been excruciating for everyone involved, for the detectives who'd worked this case for years, for Christy's family, who'd been waiting for answers for more than 2 decades, for Christy's mother, who was still alive but whose time was running out. The lab rushed the analysis. They extracted DNA from the chewing gum. They compared it to the DNA profile from Christy's crime scene. And then they delivered the news everyone had been hoping for. It was a match, perfect match. The DNA on the chewing gum belonged to the same person who'd left biological evidence at Christy Marak's crime scene. After 26 years of investigation, after more than 60 suspects, after over 1,500 interviews, after countless dead ends and false leads, they finally had him. The beloved DJ, the local celebrity. The man who'd been hiding in plain sight was Christy Marak's killer. The arrest was planned carefully. Investigators didn't want to give him any warning. They didn't want to risk him fleeing or destroying evidence. So they moved quickly. On an otherwise ordinary day, the DJ found himself surrounded by police officers. He was read his rights. He was handcuffed. And for the first time in 26 years, he was confronted with the crime he thought he'd gotten away with. The look on his face, according to the arresting officers, was one of absolute shock. He'd truly believed he was safe. He'd truly believed that after more than 2 decades, the case was so cold that he'd never be caught. The news of the arrest sent shockwaves through Lancaster. People couldn't believe it. The DJ, the guy who'd played at their weddings, the guy who'd entertained at their kids' graduation parties, the guy they'd smiled and laughed with for years. He was a murderer. It was incomprehensible. Friends defended him at first, insisting there must be some mistake. But as the evidence became public, as the DNA match was explained, the defense crumbled. There was no mistake. The science was clear. The man they'd trusted, the man they'd welcomed into their most important celebrations, had brutally murdered Christy Marak and then gone on with his life as if nothing had happened. The investigation into the motive began. Why had he killed her? What was the connection between a popular DJ and a 6th-grade teacher? The answer, it turned out, was simpler and more tragic than anyone could have imagined. They'd had a relationship, brief, complicated, and ultimately deadly. The exact nature of their connection remained somewhat unclear, but what was clear was that something had gone wrong. Maybe he wanted to end things, and she didn't. Maybe she wanted to end things, and he couldn't accept it. Maybe there was jealousy. Maybe there was betrayal. Whatever the trigger, it had resulted in him going to her home on December 21st, 1992, and beating her to death. The trial preparation began. The prosecution had an incredibly strong case. The DNA evidence was irrefutable. The genetic genealogy methodology was sound and had been used successfully in other high-profile cases. The discarded chewing gum had been collected legally. The chain of custody for all evidence was impeccable, but more than that, the prosecution had something even more powerful. They had 26 years of the defendant living freely while Christie's family suffered. They had the image of a man dancing and laughing at parties while Christie's mother fought cancer and prayed for justice. They had the audacity of a killer who thought he was smart enough to get away with murder. Christie's mother lived to see the arrest. After years of fighting, after countless treatments, after refusing to give up, she finally got the news she'd been waiting for. They'd caught him. They knew his name. They knew his face. They knew why. Her relief was palpable, but so was her exhaustion. She'd held on as long as she could. She'd fought the cancer with everything she had because she needed to know. And now, she knew. A few months after the arrest, Christie's mother passed away. Her family takes comfort in knowing that she died with answers, that she died knowing the man who killed her daughter would finally face justice. The trial, when it finally happened, was a media sensation. The courtroom was packed every day. Reporters from across Pennsylvania covered every moment. The prosecution laid out their case methodically. They explained the original investigation. They walked the jury through the crime scene. They presented the biological evidence collected in 1992. They explained how that evidence had been preserved for decades. Then they brought in the experts. Forensic scientists explained DNA analysis. Genetic genealogists explained how they had built the family tree that led to the defendant. And finally, they presented the chewing gum. One piece of chewing gum, discarded casually at a party, that had sealed the defendant's fate. The defense tried to create reasonable doubt. They questioned the genetic genealogy methodology. They suggested the possibility of contamination. They pointed out that 26 years had passed, that memories fade, that evidence degrades. But they were fighting against overwhelming scientific evidence. DNA doesn't lie. And the DNA said clearly that the defendant had been in Christy Marak's home, that his biological material had been left at the scene of her murder. There was no innocent explanation for that. The defendant himself never took the stand. His lawyers advised against it, knowing that the prosecution would tear him apart on cross-examination. So he sat silently at the defense table day after day, as witness after witness testified to his guilt, as the evidence mounted, as the prosecution built an insurmountable case. And when the jury finally retired to deliberate, there wasn't much doubt about what the verdict would be. The jury deliberated for less than a full day. When they returned to the courtroom, the forewoman stood and delivered the verdict. Guilty. Guilty of first-degree murder. Guilty of brutally ending Christy Marak's life. Guilty of robbing her students of a wonderful teacher. Guilty of causing her family decades of anguish. The courtroom erupted in emotion. Christy's family members wept, some with relief, some with the renewed pain of reliving her death. The defendant showed no emotion. He simply stared straight ahead, perhaps still unable to believe that his decades of freedom were over. The sentencing phase was equally emotional. Members of Christie's family gave victim impact statements. They described what her loss had meant to them. They talked about the Christmases they'd spent without her, The birthdays, the graduations, the weddings, all the moments she should have been there for, but wasn't because a selfish, violent man had decided she didn't deserve to live. They talked about her mother's battle with cancer, how she'd fought so hard just to see this day. They talked about the hole Christie's death had left in their lives, a hole that could never be filled no matter how much justice was served. Former students of Christie's, now adults, also spoke. They talked about how she'd believed in them, how she'd encouraged them, how she'd made learning fun, how she'd been the kind of teacher who changes lives. They talked about learning of her death when they were just children, how it had stolen their innocence and made them afraid. One former student, now in her 30s with children of her own, broke down as she explained that she'd named her daughter Christine in honor of her 6th grade teacher. The judge, after hearing all the victim impact statements, addressed the defendant directly. He spoke about the cowardice of the crime, about the arrogance of living openly in the community for 26 years while Christie's family suffered, about the callousness of entertaining at celebrations while Christie's grave went unvisited by anyone except her grieving family. And then he delivered the sentence: life in prison without the possibility of parole. The defendant would spend the rest of his natural life behind bars. He would never again perform at a wedding, never again make people dance, never again enjoy the freedom he'd stolen from Christy Maroc. As the defendant was led away in handcuffs, observers noted that he still showed no emotion, no remorse, no apology, no explanation, just silence. The same silence he'd maintained for 26 years while investigators searched for answers. The same silence he'd hidden behind while building his career and his reputation. But now that silence would be maintained behind prison walls, and whatever thoughts or feelings he had about his crime would stay locked inside him, just as he was locked inside his cell. The case of Christy Maroc's murder is both a tragedy and a triumph. A tragedy because a wonderful person died violently and senselessly. A tragedy because her family had to wait 26 years for justice. A tragedy because dozens of Christmases passed without her. But it's also a triumph of persistence by law enforcement who never closed the file, who never stopped hoping for a break. A triumph of science, of the forensic advances that made it possible to extract DNA from decades-old evidence and match it to a suspect. A triumph of new investigative techniques like genetic genealogy that are giving cold cases new life, and a triumph of determination by Christie's family, especially her mother, who refused to let her daughter be forgotten. This case also serves as a reminder that justice delayed is not necessarily justice denied. For 26 years, it seemed like Christie's killer had gotten away with murder. For 26 years, he lived freely while she lay in her grave. But in the end, science and persistence caught up with him. The piece of chewing gum he threw away without a second thought became the evidence that destroyed the life he'd built on a foundation of lies and violence. It's a powerful message to other cold case killers who think they're safe because time has passed. The evidence is still there. The science is getting better. The investigators haven't forgotten, and eventually, maybe after years or even decades, justice may still come calling. The Lancaster community has slowly healed from the shock of discovering that a beloved local figure was a murderer. There's been a lot of soul-searching about how he was able to hide in plain sight for so long. Some blame themselves for not seeing signs that weren't there. Others wonder if they should have suspected something, anything, that would have led to his earlier capture. But the reality is that sociopaths are often exceptionally good at presenting a false front. They're charming, they're likable, they blend in perfectly. And unless they make a mistake or leave evidence behind, they can maintain their disguises for decades. Christie's story has become part of the curriculum at the elementary school where she taught. Not the details of her murder, which would be inappropriate for young children, but the story of her dedication as a teacher. Every year, the school presents the Christy Marak Memorial Award to the 6th grade student who best exemplifies the qualities she valued: kindness, hard work, and enthusiasm for learning. It's a small way of ensuring she's never forgotten and that her impact on education continues even though she's no longer there to inspire students directly. The case has also become a teaching tool for forensic science programs. The combination of traditional detective work, DNA analysis, and genetic genealogy that solved Christie's murder is now studied by students learning to become the next generation of forensic investigators. The preservation of evidence from 1992 that ultimately yielded results in 2018 is held up as an example of why meticulous evidence collection and storage matters. You never know when a technological advance will make it possible to extract new information from old evidence. For the detectives who worked Christie's case over the years, the arrest and conviction brought a sense of closure mixed with sadness. They were thrilled to finally solve the case, to finally give Christie's family answers. But they were also sad that it had taken so long. Several of the original investigators had retired or even passed away before the case was solved. They never got to see the arrest. They never got to know that their work, their interviews, their evidence collection had ultimately mattered. The detectives who were still active when the arrest happened made a point of contacting retired colleagues to share the news. And at the trial, several retired detectives sat in the gallery watching the culmination of work they'd started decades earlier. The genetic genealogy aspect of the case sparked some controversy, as it often does. Privacy advocates raised concerns about the use of public genealogy databases for law enforcement purposes. They argued that people who submit their DNA to these services for family history research aren't consenting to have that information used to investigate their relatives, but victims' advocates and law enforcement pushed back, arguing that solving violent crimes and bringing killers to justice is worth the minimal privacy intrusion. The debate continues in legal and ethical circles. But for Christie's family, there's no debate. They're grateful that the technology existed and was used. Without it, her killer would still be free. The DJ's family has maintained a low profile since his arrest and conviction. Some family members have expressed shock and disbelief. Others have quietly supported him, visiting him in prison and maintaining that there must be some explanation they don't understand. It's a reminder that criminal cases don't just affect the victim's family. They also devastate the families of perpetrators who must come to terms with the fact that someone they loved was capable of terrible violence. The DJ's children, who were young adults by the time of his arrest, have had to grapple with the knowledge that their father is a murderer, that the man who raised them, who taught them right from wrong, who was present at all their important life events, had also brutally killed a woman and hidden that fact from everyone for decades. As we close this chapter on Christy Marak's case, it's worth reflecting on what her story teaches us about cold cases in general. First, they're never truly cold as long as investigators keep them open and continue to review evidence. Technology advances, witnesses' circumstances change, new techniques become available. What seems impossible to solve today might be solvable tomorrow. Second, physical evidence is crucial. If the biological evidence from Christie's crime scene hadn't been properly collected and preserved, the advances in DNA technology would have been useless. Detectives in 1992 couldn't have known that genetic genealogy would someday exist. But they collected and stored the evidence anyway, and that foresight ultimately solved the case. Third, persistence matters. The detectives who continued to work Christie's case over the years, who continued to follow up on tips and review evidence, created the environment where a breakthrough could happen. If they'd given up, if they'd filed the case away and forgotten about it, the genetic genealogy lead might never have been pursued. Christy Marak was 36 years old when she was murdered. She'd been teaching for over a decade. She'd touched hundreds of lives. She had her whole future ahead of her. And it was all stolen by a man who couldn't control his anger, who chose violence over walking away, who decided that if he couldn't have things his way, then Christy didn't deserve to live. His selfishness robbed the world of a talented educator. It robbed her students of years of learning and growth. It robbed her family of decades of love and memories. And for what? For his ego. For his inability to accept reality. For his complete lack of empathy or conscience. But Christie's legacy isn't defined by how she died. It's defined by how she lived, by the students she inspired, by the colleagues she supported, by the family she loved, by the dedication she brought to her work every single day. Her killer tried to reduce her to a victim, to make her death the most important thing about her. But her family and friends refused to let that happen. They remember her laugh, her smile, her passion for teaching, her kindness, her strength. Those are the things that matter. Those are the things that endure. Not the violence that ended her life, but the love and joy that defined it. This is why we tell these stories here on Famous Cold Case. Not to glorify violence or sensationalize tragedy, but to ensure that victims are remembered, to show that time and distance don't make justice impossible, to demonstrate that families who refuse to give up, who continue to fight for answers, can sometimes see their persistence rewarded, to prove that killers who think they've gotten away with murder may discover, even decades later, that they were wrong, and to honor the memory of people like Christy Marak, whose lives were cut short but whose impact continues. If this story has moved you, if you believe that every victim deserves justice no matter how long it takes, then I need you to do 3 things right now. Subscribe to Famous Cold Case so you never miss another story. Hit that like button to help this video reach more people who care about unsolved cases. And leave a comment sharing your thoughts. Did this case surprise you? Your engagement keeps these stories alive and helps ensure that victims are never forgotten. Thank you for watching, and remember, the truth is always worth waiting for. Justice may be delayed, but it should never be denied. Christy Marak waited 26 years for her killer to be caught. Her mother fought cancer just to see this day. And in the end, a single piece of chewing gum brought down a man who thought he was untouchable. If that's not a powerful reminder that killers can never truly rest easy, I don't know what is. Keep fighting for justice. Keep demanding answers. And keep remembering the victims whose stories deserve to be told.